Hey guys, welcome back to another video of the Next Man Up podcast. And today we got a lot to talk about. We're just going to be talking about the NBA playoffs. We've had a few games, a few series starting to wrap up where we have a good sense of where they're going to be. And just to get everything out of the way, we don't really have much to talk about in the NFL today, just because there hasn't been as much. So this might be a little shorter of an episode. But with that being said, we might as well just dive right into it. The first series that we'll talk about the two series that happened last night as of this recording. First one we'll talk about is the Sixers going up 3-2 over the Celtics, and mixed emotions about this one. Obviously happy, but I've seen this story before. What do you think about last game, this series overall? I guess the last two games at this point now being kind of down to the wire with the last game before this last one, and then a blowout in the last game.
Yeah, clearly I have a lot to talk about with this. This is where me and Banning disagree the most as a Celtics fan, a Sixers fan. But I mean, just to talk about game 5, which as we're recording, we saw last night. I mean, Boston shot under 40% from the field, and you're just never going to beat a team like Philly shooting that low. One of my big points is, and I'm going to get straight into this. I mentioned this last episode. I'm not going to waste time or skip around it. When do we start being able to blame people other than Jason Tatum? Because as I mentioned, if you go on social media, if you talk to your friends, everyone's going to point the finger at Jason Tatum. But the only thing Jason Tatum's really done wrong is shoot a low percentage from the field, from three. And that is every single player on the Boston Celtics right now. You know, say what you will about Jaylen Brown being consistent, but I don't see anybody shooting consistently great from three right now. And when do we get to mention the other Boston Celtics? I mean, this is a Celtics team that has a higher seed, that is down 3-2, has lost in TD Garden on multiple occasions this series. And we have to start pointing fingers to some of the other Celtics. I mean, straight to it, Derek White. Derek White this season has been incredible. 82 games, played every single game. And when some of the other Celtics, fluttered a little bit towards the middle of the season, Derek White was genuinely winning player of the week, defensive player, all these great accolades. But as we look into the playoffs, it's been a different story. I mean, he was just elected to the All NBA defensive second team, and he's letting James Harden and Tyrese Maxey absolutely obliterate them. It is embarrassing, and that goes for Marcus Smart as well. But I will give Smart a little more credit for being active on the offensive side. But it gets to a point where there's a couple more guys I'll talk about after I give you some room to talk. It's a Celtics team that's not performing up to their standards, and it gets to a point where we have to look a little bit farther than maybe just blaming Tatum or Brown or Missoula. It goes a lot deeper than that. But, I want to hear what you have to say about how Philly's been doing.
Yeah, first thing I want to say, obviously Derek White, a good defender, but I lost a lot of credibility this year with the second team defense with one player that's on that team specifically, but we can skip past him. The one thing I want to talk about too, I think number 0 in this series for both sides has been probably the biggest asset or downfall for both teams. Obviously, Jason Tatum was struggling from the field, but then if you look at his stats at the end of the game, last game they got blown out, still drops 36 points. He took 30 shots. Him and Devin Booker both looked up to a player who they're really starting to play like at this point, except without showing up when they need to. They're taking a lot of shots, and Jaylen Brown, like you said, has been consistent. Last game, I would say the guy that you want to look at has been Al Horford. He went 0 for 7 and only shot threes. And he has been pretty good this series overall, only shooting 35% before last game. I'm sure that's probably tanked at this point, but I thought he shot a lot better than that going into last game. But apparently it was only 35%. It just seemed like he kind of started to cook when he needed to.
Yeah. Well,
And
I don't want to interject, but that brings me to one of my big points I had on here. And I'm going to kick it back to you right after this. But Al Horford is not supposed to be the starting center for the Celtics team at this point. I mean, we look at Robert Williams, and it's kind of come to fruition this series that he's not big enough and he's not healthy enough to make it a whole series against your guy, the NBA MVP, Joel Embiid. I mean, you can't rely on Robert Williams to play you 20 minutes a night, which is absolutely heartbreaking because that puts, Al Horford out there. And although he's had his big moments, I mean, we've seen time and time and again, Joel Embiid is having his way in this series even more than he did against Brooklyn in the last series.
Yeah. Like you said, Robert Williams has just not been able to do anything against Embiid, and they have more success with Grant Williams guarding him, honestly. One game that I do want to bring up, though, game 4, it looked like Embiid, I know he dropped 34 in the end, but he was really struggling against Al Horford, especially in that fourth quarter. He was almost scared to take a lot of the shots. And one spot that I want to mention too, going into this series, going into last game, Philly blowing them out, I did not expect that. I thought they were going to lose by 6 or 7 before the game. But one moment I want to bring up is James Harden struggling in game 3. He drove to the rim, had an open shot, and passed it out. And that I remember seeing that before with another player that we all know, but that was a moment where I really thought this series was over. And then last game 4, when they ended up winning by 1, that was just back and forth. And the Sixers honestly should have lost that game. They made a lot of mistakes, but they ended up with the win. And then coming out in TD Garden, which I want to talk about that a little bit too. That obviously a huge win, huge momentum shifter. And no one on the Celtics, I mean, Jason Tatum with 36, he ended with 36. I know it's kind of hard to look at that. I still don't think it's a great game, taking 30 shots too. But Jaylen Brown with 24, and then Marcus Smart with 14. No one else above double digits for them. That's ended up with a loss. But one stat I do want to bring up that they talked about after the game on Inside the NBA, the Celtics are 10-10 at home in the last 20 playoff games, and that's a big problem. So even if this series goes back to game 7, how confident would you be with the Celtics at home?
I mean, I think you said it yourself, not as much as I should be. You'd suspect a team that if the Celtics go and catch game 6, we're looking at 3-3 going home to a top 2 seed. And as a fan, I'm not even confident. And that's, I think you bring up an amazing point. That's a huge issue. These are teams that are supposed to capitalize at winning at home. We look at past champions such as the Warriors. I know the Warriors, we're going to talk about them later, and a bit of haywire right now, but they made their mark winning at home in the playoffs. And that's what led them to be such a great championship team for years and years. I mean, this Boston team is interesting. I want to bring up a point that I feel like isn't touched upon enough. The Celtics obviously build their team around Tatum and Brown, clearly, but they've also locked themselves into their role players for a lot longer than we see with other teams. I mean, Marcus Smart is on a long-term deal. Robert Williams is on a long-term deal. Even Horford's going to have another year in Boston. I mean, it gets to a point where you want to change the team a little bit, and the Celtics find ways to bring guys in. They brought in Gallinari, who obviously hasn't been able to play this year. 2 years ago, bringing in Derek White in the first place was a good move, but it gets kind of nerve-wracking because if this Celtics team continues to not be able to win an NBA Finals, like it's not looking great this year, they're kind of locked into this core. And I know they have young guys, they have the ability to get out of it, but this isn't a team that can do what the Lakers did and retool halfway through the season. They have long-term guys that are making a lot of money that are going to be hard to unload. So, if the Celtics can't figure this out, where do you think this leads them in the future?
Well, I was just about to ask you that question too, especially with Jaylen Brown. Very interesting too. Going into this playoffs, I expected the Celtics to make the finals, or even if they lost in the Eastern Conference Finals to the Bucks, that's not really a loss of a season. But losing in the second round after going to the finals last year, being the 2 seed, seeing the Bucks out of the playoffs already. I mean, we both know whoever wins this series should have a very easy time next series against the winner of the Heat and the Knicks, which we probably know is the Knicks or the Heat, unless we see some crazy comeback. But Jaylen Brown, I think it's very interesting because, like I said before, if it's in the finals, it's a lot different. You run it back. But in the second round, especially the way that I'm sure looking through his eyes, he knows that he's been consistent in these playoffs, and seeing Jason Tatum kind of struggle a little bit. And once we've got into the third and the fourth quarter, obviously Jason Tatum ended with so many points. He just takes every single shot. And it's the same thing that we've seen with Devin Booker in all the Suns games. They just take every single shot. So especially with Ime Udoka going to the Rockets, Jaylen Brown was probably the most vocal about him throughout that whole entire process. So it'd be very interesting too, because I feel like he would kind of be in this question of, how much he thinks his self-worth is. Going into the season, we heard a lot of rumors too that the only way he would stay is if he made all NBA and got the max contract, because if he missed out, he would be missing out on 100+ million. So very interesting. In the second round, if they end up losing this series, how confident are you that Jaylen Brown decides to come back?
Yeah, and excuse me. This is a question that's floated around for Celtics fans for it's been years now. I mean, nobody expected Jaylen Brown to take these leaps and bounds so quickly. I mean, you invest an early pick in this guy, but you look at all the other guys that went early in that draft, and I'm looking at guys like Josh Jackson. You know, you never know what you're going to get when you take the dude. And obviously, as we've seen, Jaylen Brown is an all NBA caliber player, but Jaylen Brown is also probably the most vocal on the Celtics about how much he dislikes the Celtics in moments. And that definitely makes it nervous, makes me nervous as a Boston sports fan. I think we could see him on the way out, but that's something that I think we're gonna have to wait and see on a little bit. I think it comes a lot deeper than a player being vocal because we've seen guys with loud personalities and they're definitely people that said a lot about the teams they were on, stay with the team for a long time. I think of guys like Michael Jordan, he was always quick to criticize his players. Even Kobe Bryant, Dirk Nowitzki. I mean, they would be the first ones to say if something was wrong with their team. And they were lifers. Michael Jordan only had 1 year outside of the Bulls. So although Jaylen Brown is not at those guys' level, he is another star who is very vocal about his team not reaching the success that he hopes for. So it's interesting. Obviously, on paper, it's a little nerve-wracking to see a guy who has mentioned very good things about teams that aren't his own when he's coming up on a bigger free agency year. But yeah, I think a lot could happen with that. I think if the Celtics find success this year, as you mentioned, he's a lock to stay. But if not, if Philly can wrap this thing up, then who really knows? And if Jaylen Brown leaves, the Celtics have invested so much money into their other guys, as I mentioned, that how are you going to find his replacement? And if Tatum can't do it with Brown, is he going to do it without him? I think that's a interesting point that I'm scared I might know the answer to.
Yeah, and another thing too, looking into this, after game one, there was reports when James Harden cooked Marcus Smart that Jaylen Brown couldn't guard Harden unless he went to Marcus Smart and asked him for permission. And another issue going into this, I guess, is the big three that they have. You have two guys who are top, whatever label you want to put on it, probably at least top 25, both of them combined, probably top 20.
I would put higher. Yeah.
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 And neither one of them I would consider the leader of their team, because Marcus Smart is so vocal about being the leader of the team. And it's very interesting the way that you look at it, especially if he leaves, Marcus Smart having to fill the role of the second best player on the team. It's really interesting to look at. Jason Tatum will probably be in that 08, 09 Lakers era where he's taking 40 shots a game. Like, we'll see. So Jaylen Brown, I mean, we talked about this probably a month ago, and the answer was probably more of a resounding no, but it was kind of just right when we saw Ime Udoka go there. So we were talking about it. But now, very interesting if depending on how this second round goes.
Yeah, one thing I want to say, so I don't go another week without mentioning this, and this is crazy. I know I talked about how on the last episode of Boston fans are spoiled and all that. I just pointing out the flaws of the team that I watch every night. Jaylen Brown is not a good defender. I don't know what it is. Jaylen Brown has historically been a great defender. And this series, he has been lackluster to say the least. I mean, I call out Derek White. I call out Marcus Smart. I think it's time for me to call out Jaylen Brown. I mean, we saw in game 4, the 76ers needed a big shot to send it to overtime. And of course, they're looking at Harden. Jaylen Brown crashes the paint on a shot that would have only tied the game, allows James Harden to get a wide open 3 in the corner. I mean, that is ridiculous. I understand that, and it's just funny to me because Jaylen Brown is known as the smartest dude in the NBA. He has incredible IQ off the court, but then it gets him these big moments on the court, and I don't see it. There are some people that we know personally that like to go on Facebook and complain about Jason Tatum and call him names and how he's lacking intelligence. And then we see their favorite player, the only player that I guess Celtics fans can agree on being good, Jaylen Brown, do worse and worse. I mean, I don't understand. If Jaylen Brown and I like him a lot. I have his jersey. I'm a big fan, but I guess to a point, if he really is this top 20, 25 player that we think he is, why doesn't he play like it? Why doesn't he? If he really is so good, why is Jason Tatum allowed to shoot every shot in the clutch? Why is Jaylen Brown allowing these defensive mishaps when he's supposedly so good at defense? I mean, I'm getting a little, fired up here, but this is one of my favorite players who just isn't performing. And then, like Celtics fans always like to do, let's just yell at Jason Tatum instead. I don't get it. Really, I don't.
Well, one thing I want to bring up too that you were talking about, the clutch shots. It seems like in this series, the guy that was taking all the clutch shots has been Marcus Smart. So especially in that game 4. So it's very interesting dynamic between the three of them right now. And I don't know how this series is going to end. I want to say that Philly wins, but I'm not. I'm confident going into game 6, but I know how it could go. I mean, we saw the Celtics versus the Bucks last year in game 6, but we need Embiid to come out here in this game and just need to be able to play good. And as long as Lil Baby's there, I'm not worried about it. But I think either one of these teams, I know the Jimmy Butler experience has been fun, but either one of these teams, especially if it's the Sixers, the way they're built, I expect them to win every single game in this series by 10 plus. I think there may be one game where Jimmy Butler drops a lot and gets close. But interesting, one thing I want to bring up too before we move on to the next series, kind of looking forward, if the Sixers do win, the biggest guy in this series will be Tobias Harris, whether anyone wants to like it or not. It's Tobias Harris and Jimmy Butler. Tobias Harris, obviously the 4th scoring option, sometimes the 3rd, depending on the guard play, but 3rd or 4th scoring option in the game. So he's not going to be able to make as much of an impact as Jimmy Butler. But when they face off, he is going to hear everything. I mean, this has been leading up to this point where Jimmy Butler obviously talking about deciding to keep Tobias Harris instead of him, even though Jimmy Butler was offered the max and decided to leave himself, but that's a different story. So going into that series, if we see both of those teams advance, Tobias Harris has to play a big role, which he kind of dropped off in this series, even though the Sixers are up. But like I said before this playoff started, if Tobias Harris can drop 15 to 20 points consistently, the Sixers are going to be really hard to beat because he is the best 4th scoring option in the league and would probably be a 3rd or 2nd scoring option on most teams.
Yeah, I completely agree with that statement. To your point about the 76ers, if they do get the heat, they beat the Celtics, how they should win by 10 every game. I agree. I think the 76ers, we will argue if the 76ers or the Celtics are the better team, that's very close. I think the 76ers match up much better with a potential Miami team than the Celtics do. We see the Celtics every year, it feels like, play the Heat very tough in the playoffs. And we saw in 2020, it resulted in an L. 2020, bubble, it was an L. Last year, it was a W. You never really know. But I think that gives us a perfect chance to kick it to the Heat Knicks series. You mentioned the playoff Jimmy experience. And, up to this point, playoff Jimmy has been real and he's been scary. The Heat are up 3-1 right now. It's going back to New York tonight, I believe. And there's a lot at stake. Obviously, seeing an 8 seed go this far is not something we've seen in a long, long time since like 1990s Houston Rocket stuff. And I just wanted to ask you, how real is this team? Or do you think they've kind of just been having a Mickey Mouse run, maybe?
I think they got to a point, obviously beating the Bucks in the first round where no one expected. Giannis was healthy for a good amount of that series too, but the Bucks made a lot of mistakes, which we ended up seeing, obviously firing Bud after that. And there's a lot going to go on with Giannis. We don't know how that future looks with the Bucks, but this team has been good. They came into this round against the Heat or against the Knicks. They match up decently well, and Julius Randle has absolutely just fallen off in the playoffs like he does every single year, and that's the biggest reason why the Heat are up that much. If he plays where he should be playing, I think the Knicks with their guard play, depending on how Jalen Brunson plays, he doesn't even need to be insane, but we've seen him have some really good games, even though they lose. if Julius Randle plays the way that he should, he doesn't cancel out with Jimmy Butler. Jimmy Butler's better, but it does a lot better than him dropping 15 points per game and shooting 15% from three. And we saw this the same way when they played against the Hawks. That's why the Hawks were able to just run over them a few years ago, because Julius Randle could not get it done in the playoffs. This Heat team, though, I think if they make the Eastern Conference Finals, like I said, especially if they play against the Sixers, I expect Embiid to absolutely bully Bam Adebayo, especially the way that Bam's kind of been playing in the playoffs. He's brought it up a little bit, but there's definitely some holes in there. He hasn't been playing as well defensively in the playoffs than we've seen throughout the regular season. But this team, I think, going past the first round, that was a success. I think when they were up 2-1, I thought that was a success on the season. So even if they lose in the Eastern Conference Finals, I think it's good. Are they real? I think they're a good team, but I don't think they beat the Celtics or the Sixers. I think at most they get one game off because Jimmy Butler goes off. And especially if it's against the Sixers, we see James Harden not play that well. But still a great season overall, depending on how they do it. I assume they get it done in 5 or 6. I don't think it goes to 7, but they should wrap this up pretty easily.
Yeah, one thing I wanted to bring up about this Heat team is I think we may have been underrating them a little bit going into it. I mean, clearly as they won, but just looking back on it, I think maybe we were missing a point because they're not an ordinary 8th seed. I know they could have been 7th seed, whatever you call it, but they're not a normal play-in team because they skated by all year in the regular season. They fought some injuries. They had some bad luck towards the middle of the season, but this was a team that was competing for the finals last year, taking games off the Celtics in TD Garden, like we see this year with the 76ers. And then the year before was fighting in the finals, or, 2 years before, was fighting in the finals against LeBron. And they haven't lost any major pieces from those runs. I mean, if you look at it, those runs were led by Jimmy Butler, Kyle Lowry, Bam Adebayo. Those guys are all still there. I know we've seen Lowry take a step back. You can argue that we saw Jimmy take a step up, but as long as those guys are there, this Heat team is making waves. And we saw it in the first round. They shockingly took out the Bucks. And as we saw the other side, I'm going to kick it over to the Knicks run. We both had Cleveland taking care of the Knicks pretty easily. And Jalen Brunson just had a one-man show, pretty much. I mean, Julius Randle was there. He was alive for a game or two, but Brunson took care of business all on his own. So we see a team made of, finals contenders as of the last couple of years versus basically Jalen Brunson. And I think we still almost expected the Knicks to win. I think we might have been being a little bit unreasonable. I mean, it's clearly right now the difference between one solid, really good team versus one solid, really good player. I mean, Jalen Brunson, trust me, I know he's been doing his best, but the Knicks don't have any other options. I don't think Quickly's been the guy we saw in the regular season. Josh Hart, he's been a good piece, but he can't be a shooting threat. And the fact, I love the guy, but Isaiah Hartenstein getting clutch minutes in the playoffs, this isn't a Knicks team built to win. They were getting lucky with Jalen Brunson being so good, and Julius Randle, we were banking on him showing up. Shooting 4 from 18 from 3 in the series clearly doesn't help your offensive side of the ball, but he's also been a non-factor on the defensive side of the ball. I mean, I know there's much more to defense in the stats, but Banning, we're 5 games in and he hasn't had a steal or a block in any single game. That's pretty horrible. So we look at it, the Heat are up 3-1. I agree they handle business, but then they go and take on a Celtics team or a Sixers team that is built better, and who knows what happens after that. If you ask me, I don't think the magic for the Heat is going to stay around much longer, but I think they benefited from more than just playoff Jimmy. I think they have a really solid team around him. And as we've seen, I mean, it could lead them to success. I don't have them making the finals or anything, but we can't act like it would be the end of the world if they did. This is a good team.
Yeah. And speaking about the West, who they would end up playing against, we'll bounce it over to there.
Yeah.
The first series that we can talk about, the Nuggets are up 3-2. And in this series, we have seen a lot of offense and the home team winning every single game. Last game that we saw last night, the Nuggets blew out the Suns. They were up by 16 to 20 points pretty much the whole entire game. Devin Booker and KD both dropped 28 and 26, but not really getting much besides that. DeAndre Ayton dropped 14. But like we've talked about so much, Bruce Brown, 25 points off the bench, has been amazing, elite, whatever you want to say. Jokic with a triple double too. And the rest of the team, this team is just built well. We said the same thing last week, where the Nuggets team is just great all around, and the Suns are really top heavy, especially without Chris Paul. I don't know if he was injured last time we talked. I don't think he was, but now he's going to be out, and he's not as much of a scoring threat, but you can't leave him wide open, and he gets people assists and gets the ball around. And so far in this series, I mean, I expect the Suns to go back at home and win the game like we've seen in this whole entire series. So I think it goes to 7, but I wouldn't be surprised if the Nuggets win in 6 or 7. I just think they're the better team overall and should win this series.
Yeah, we talked earlier in the year. I had Denver as my finals favorite, and I think we've seen exactly why. Now, each Nuggets win they've had, yes, it's been at home, but it's also been highlighted by one of their role players, as you mentioned. I mean, I think that's great analysis because we look at Jokic, you look at Jamal Murray, but they win because they're so much deeper than that. I mean, game one, we saw Aaron Gordon, who, yeah, he's a starter, but he's probably one of their least dangerous starters game by game. Game one was all Aaron Gordon. Game two was KCP. And last night we saw Bruce Brown. I mean, we're banking on, we are banking on Jokic and Jamal Murray to have great games, but that's not much of a risk when they continue to do it over and over again. Obviously, Michael Porter Jr. is an X factor. You don't always know what you're going to get from him, but when you have these role players stepping up and being more than just their role, the team is incredible. I mean, I'll have to mention this because I know you probably don't want to give him a whole lot of credit, and I don't blame you. He's not your guy. But Devin Booker has been on a tear this series. Last night wasn't his best night by any means, but he's really been going out there. And as you mentioned earlier, it's very strange to see a team with Kevin Durant on it, where Kevin Durant's not the guy shooting the clutch shots at the end of the game. Even when KD was in Golden State, and this is a take that you have that I second very heavily, KD was the best player on those Golden State teams. Obviously, he was the best player in Brooklyn and those OKC teams. And he is the best player on the Suns team, but he's not taking the big shots. I just want to ask, do you think there's a reason for that? And if so, what is it? Like, why is Booker the guy that's getting all the clutch looks and KD's kind of playing second fiddle right now?
It seems like what we've talked throughout these past few games. Devin Booker, obviously very elite in the mid-range, which we've seen at during both home games, game 3 and game 4. But it seems like you said, Kevin Durant kind of just standing more towards the side, and whether that is letting Devin Booker shoot the shots or just not getting the pass, Devin Booker kind of goes up the court, and it's the same thing that we've seen from Tatum, dribbles the clock out and then takes the shot, whether it's a good shot or not. We see a pick and roll from the top, and then he ends up dribbling the whole clock out and takes the shot. And for Devin Booker, it's been going in recently. There was a big stretch where I forget exactly how many shots, but he was shooting like 85%, 90% in his last jump shots in game 3 and game 4. So I'll give him some credit there. But especially last game, there just wasn't anyone else on the Suns that could get it done off the bench. And the Suns won in game 4 because they had Landry Shamet come in and dominate in that fourth quarter. And the Nuggets just overall are a better team. Going into this series, I think we all knew that they were the better team. It was just depending on if Kevin Durant and Devin Booker could get it done. Even when Chris Paul was in there, we knew he wasn't going to be that much of a scoring threat overall. But it's still a big loss to not have him out there. I think the Nuggets should get this done. I would assume in 7. I think the Suns can get it done there. But especially with Jokic not being suspended, I say that they get it done. I could see them getting it done in Phoenix, but based on this series so far, I think Phoenix gets it. But the Nuggets should win this in 7.
Yeah, I want to bring up one more point before we kick it to the last series, and that's, the biggest, I want to say, non-factor that Phoenix has had, and that's DeAndre Ayton. I mean, he is just not in the same role that he was when we were talking, a couple years ago when they were playing the Bucks in the finals. Doesn't look like the same player. He was the obviously number 1 overall pick, very promising center, drafted over guys like Luka Doncic and Trae Young, but he has barely been able to play this series. Phoenix has got to a point where they trust Jock Landale out of Australia more than him to guard Jokic. And it brings a question that I know it might be on the spot you may not have thought of, but when we really think about it, what can Aiton's future be if you can't play him in the playoffs? And he hasn't been the number one overall pick that we expected him to be. I mean, if I'm a Phoenix fan, that's what I'm the most worried about because you'll have a healthy offseason. You'll get Booker and KD more settled with each other if you lose. You figure it out next year. But the one thing you can't figure it out is what you're going to do at center. And when you draft Aiton, you assume that's going to be like your building block for the future. But now it feels like we don't even know. So I just want to hear your thoughts on that before we move on.
Yeah, this was a question that a lot of people had going into the last off season, and people weren't even sure if he was going to re-sign. The Suns believed in him, though. They gave him a 4-year, $133 million. He's locked in for $30 to $35 million for the next 3 years. So he's got to be able to take a step up. And he's the third scoring option at this point because Chris Paul taking a step back. But he needs to play like the third scoring option. He doesn't need to go out there and drop 25 points a game if KD and Booker in the playoffs are going to drop 40 or 35 each, but he needs to be able to at least go out there and do something. He's just like Julius Randle that we just talked about. He's just not been able to show up in the playoffs, and especially in that finals against the Bucks, Giannis dropping 50 points. He is able to just absolutely dominate against DeAndre Ayton, and it's really interesting to look at because Ayton could drop 15 to 20 points. And if he does that and Devin Booker and Kevin Durant do what they do, they just need one other player off the bench to be decent and they win the game. But DeAndre Ayton, especially in this series, has just not been able to do anything. And for the Suns, it's going to be a really interesting offseason too, because they have a lot of role players and a lot of bench players that aren't bad, but it just, I don't know. They have a lot to work on.
Yeah, I agree with that.
So we're good with that series.
Yeah, I mean, we could spend all day talking about how I don't trust the Suns and, Monty Williams can only do so much, but, there's another big series that I'm sure everyone at home wants to hear about. So we might as well just kick it over to that.
Yeah, and that series being the Lakers up 3-1 against the Warriors. And looking at this series, I had both of these teams advancing, and I had the Warriors beating them in 6. But it's when I had that written down, I believed in it more. But going into the series, I really thought the Lakers could get it done, and they've just been playing better. Steph Curry has done what he needs to do, but the rest of this team, Jordan Poole dropping 0 points, not going to help the team at all. He's lost his touch, especially in this series. He was decent in the first series, but recently he's just been bad, and that's really harming the team overall. Obviously, LeBron and AD have both been great. Last game, we saw Lonnie Walker come in for the first time and dropped 15 points in the fourth quarter and single-handedly won them that game. It was close throughout the whole entire game, especially the fourth quarter, but he came out and got it done. And I think the Lakers get this done. I don't know if they get it done in 5 just because it's hard to win in Golden State, but they've proven this series that they could get one done there. So I'd assume they get it done in 6 at the most. If they bounce the series back to LA, I don't see them losing that game.
Yeah, and if I can be honest, I agree with you, which is a wild statement because, as we mentioned, I was low on the Lakers all year, and recently I've gotten a little low on the Warriors, but still, I would have assumed this would have been an easy series for Golden State, and it looks the complete opposite direction. With that being said, the Jordan Poole thing is something we've seen before, and it's just kind of a talking point I want to bring up a little bit. We see this with 6 men all the time, especially in the playoffs. They're great players off the bench that contribute, and you need that in the playoffs, but it gets to a point where you remember why 6 men are 6 men in the first place. They're inconsistent, they can be streaky, and a lot of times we see those guys be streaky in the playoffs. I mean, one thing we didn't mention about the Celtics is I've been impressed with how Malcolm Brogdon has been pretty consistent throughout the playoffs because it's not something we see with guys off the bench very often. I mean, we see it with Quickly in New York, and we're really seeing it with Poole and Golden State. I mean, they look flustered. They're not ready. I know Poole is a young guy. I really think we got to give it more time. It's not like he's hit his prime or anything, but you expect more and he's just not giving it to you. But a guy that we expect a lot out of that has given us a lot, finally, it feels like, is Anthony Davis. I've said it before and I'll say it again. I think Anthony Davis is probably the most important player on the Lakers. I know that sounds crazy with LeBron, but the Lakers move when Anthony Davis does. And man, he's been moving. I mean, we're at a point in his career where, especially when he was in New Orleans, people were projecting him to be the best player in the league at this point. Obviously, he's not there yet, but when we see the glimpses of that, this Lakers team is unstoppable. I mean, we know at this point with how consistent LeBron's been and how tough he is in the playoffs, we know what we're going to get. But when Anthony Davis is giving us, maybe even MVP caliber performances, I would obviously not the MVP this year. He hasn't been consistent, but we both know he has the talent. I mean, that's why this Lakers team is controlling their stuff with Golden State. Shout out to your boy Looney. I know he's getting a lot of rebounds. I'm a fan of his personally, but they don't have a big that can guard Anthony Davis. And when he goes out there and doesn't play scared, he plays aggressive and he proves it. That's when this Lakers team is close to unbeatable. And that is wild to say for a seventh seed in the West.
Yeah, well, Steve Kerr decided to take Looney out of the starting lineup anyway, so I don't really know what's going on with that. But one player in this series overall that we've seen be really hot and cold, and especially last game very cold, D'Angelo Russell, which is very interesting because if he was on, it almost seems like the Lakers could have swept them if they're up 3-1 right now. But he has been on and off, and for the Lakers to be up 3-1 right now and D'Angelo not really find his groove yet is very scary looking at the Lakers, because this team was built, like we said before the series started, they've been able to win because they get the rebounds and they drive the ball, and they're going against a team like the Warriors where Clay and Curry are going to do good. Clay didn't do great in the last game, but we know what we're going to get from Clay, and a revolving door of whoever the third guard is. They had Gary Payton play last game. He actually played very well, dropping 15 points on 7 for 9, but Jordan Poole just didn't do good. That's why Gary Payton got the minutes. Moses Moody also getting a lot of minutes too, ended up getting almost double what Jordan Poole did. Dante DiVincenzo playing through there too. They just haven't been able to guard the forwards on the Lakers, and that's been the biggest thing in this series. And obviously Austin Reeves being able to go out there and drop 21 points. Very hard to beat the Lakers when they can drive the ball and also pass it out to have a shooter in whoever's in at that time. I mean, Lonnie Walker last game, but usually having Austin Reeves, D'Angelo Russell, and Dennis Schroeder out there, even Rui Hachimura, we've seen him have great games recently. So they're probably, I mean, we're talking about the Heat on the other side, but the Lakers too, we've seen play-in teams this year just being able to arguably make it to the Eastern and Western Conference Finals unless something huge happens.
Yeah. And if you told me in December that we'd be applauding the Lakers' ability to kick it out to shooters, I would think you're messing with me, because that is a complete 180 from the trade deadline. And that's why the Lakers made the moves that they did. So I'm going to ask you a question to wrap up our opinions on this that I never would have really been expecting to be asking you. And that's, if you think the Lakers could really do it all this year, is there a world where this is the Lakers championship to win?
I know you have a very different opinion. You said last week if the Lakers make it, they would probably get swept by the Nuggets. And it's really interesting. It depends on which Anthony Davis we get. If we get the Anthony Davis that is getting 5 blocks a game and 15 rebounds going against Jokic, we saw how good Jokic did, and in game 4 dropping, I think it was 53, and the rest of the team not getting it done. So even if they're able to battle it out, it's going to be really interesting. It depends. I think the biggest thing in this series, if they play the Nuggets, which I'm assuming both teams get it done, but it's going to be the role players for both teams. We know what LeBron's going to do. We know what Jokic is going to do. Jamal Murray has been good in the playoffs, and we might see some games from him, but it depends. I think just the rest of the teams, obviously, like we talked about, D'Angelo Russell, Austin Reeves, going to be big. Bruce Brown too. And it's going to be a big series, but I don't know if I have an official prediction right now, but I could see the Lakers making some noise. But if they do make it to the Eastern Conference or the finals overall, if they were to match up right now, predictions wise, I guess, if they were to match up against a team like either the Celtics or the Sixers, the Celtics would be really interesting matchup wise, but the Sixers with Embiid versus Anthony Davis, I don't know. I think the Lakers, I feel like they could get it done in the Western Conference Finals, depending on what we see, but I don't know if I wouldn't say it's their championship to lose, but I wouldn't be surprised if they made the finals.
Yeah. And I don't have much more to say on that. I think my statement rings true from last episode. I think if the Lakers and the Nuggets both get it done, I have the Nuggets taking care of business easily there. Just based on what I've seen in the past and what I've seen this year, I like that matchup for them. If it's Phoenix, then we're talking different because I have no idea. Phoenix and the Lakers are both very iffy, but when they shine, they shine. So, I mean, with that being said, I don't have much comments left on that series, but we're in a drastically different place in the playoffs than I think either of us thought we would be at this point.
Yeah. One final thing I want to talk about is Steph Curry, who is now 0 for 15, 0 for 14 from the field on shots to take the lead in the final 50 seconds of playoff games. And one person I think we need to all apologize to is Max Kellerman. He said he wanted Iguodala to take the shot, and I mean, Iguodala wouldn't have a worse shooting percentage. So even if he made one, he'd be better. So it's really interesting to look at that. And one question I want to see, especially going into this, obviously we saw the Warriors win last year, but with the questions with Draymond and Klay Thompson, obviously taking a step back, he's getting older. Curry's not getting any younger either. Questions with the bench players. If the Warriors lose, I guess overall, is this their last chance for a championship? Is the dynasty over after this season?
I have to watch my steps a little bit because I've probably said yes 3 years in a row. So I have considered this a bit. I'm glad you asked. I'm going to say yes again. And I know these are the kind of takes that come around and bite me. I'll go on for hours saying good stuff, and this is the stuff that comes back and gets me. But, you got to put it all out there sometimes. And I think it's about time because Klay Thompson has been good these playoffs, but his injuries and his declining play overall, it worries me. I understand he's been himself, but I feel like we're at a point where we can't always bake on that. And Andrew Wiggins is interesting. I think he's a good player. I think he gets a lot of hate sometimes for no reason, but he's also had health concerns, and you also don't know what you're going to get from him. I think Draymond's pretty much done. The Warriors are at a point where after this season, they're probably better off moving on from him. And then still, you have to figure out what happened at center. If James Wiseman was a project that was working really well right now, and he was a guy that was still on the Warriors and was really good and promising, then I think the Warriors would have a chance. I mean, that's why they drafted him over a guy like LaMelo Ball in the first place, because he was supposed to be that plug-and-play center that keeps the dynasty going. But after that project failed and Wiseman's not as good as we may have hoped for, it puts their timeline to an end a lot sooner than it could have been. Curry, he might have a LeBron sort of career. I know he doesn't rely heavily on athleticism, which means his longevity could be a lot longer. He will be a good player for years after this, by all means. But when I see injuries to the other guys and I see, a center, a big man in general position that is yet to be figured out, it worries me. So it might not be done. I still think this is a playoff team for years in the future, but this might be their last shot to make a finals in a while. I would go out and say that.
Yeah, and especially with Draymond playing with LeBron next year, as we've seen him talk about too. So overall, one question I do want to ask before we wrap up the episode, with the Celtics and Sixers series, I think we both agree whoever wins that would beat the winner of the Heat and the Knicks series. So assuming you have the Nuggets beating the Lakers, if we see a Nuggets and Sixers matchup in the finals, how do you think this series plays out? How many games, the overall feel of this series?
Overall feel is probably the best way to put it because it would be electric. I mean, there is probably no bigger beef in NBA social media right now than Jokic fans versus Embiid fans. And these guys have been top 2 in MVP voting for years on years. And let's just be honest here. Aside from that, they are the 2 best players in the NBA right now. So that would be absolutely electric. You can't ask for anything better in a finals than the 2 best players to be going head to head. And having it be a big man matchup reminds me of, some 90s old days stuff. I mean, this is like seeing, you know, I don't even know, Hakeem versus David Robinson, like, sort of matchup like that. These absolute Goliaths
Kayvon
going at
Looney
it.
versus Rob Will.
Yeah, exactly. These amazing finals matchups. But I mean, with that being said, the field would be electric. That would probably be the best matchup out of any two teams. And that's coming from me as a Celtics fan. I think the Nuggets match up very good against the Celtics. So when it comes to, I think, the two teams that are the hardest to guard in the NBA, I put the Nuggets and the Sixers top two. So that's a series that if it happens, based on everything I've just said, I can only really predict it going to seven, right? I mean, these two teams are electric. I think that these are two teams with also the most underrated home court experience in the whole league. I mean, I know a lot of people don't think Denver has this electric attitude, but it gets absolutely riled up in the Mile High for the playoffs. I would say the exact same things about Philly. I think that would be, obviously my dream finals matchup would be the Celtics beating somebody else. Doesn't matter. But when it comes to the best possible games we're going to see, that would be Philly and Denver. So I would not be opposed to that. If the Celtics can't figure it out, I want to see Philly play Denver. I think that would be electric. And I'm not even going to give you a team I think would win because we'd have to wait and see on that one. I know that's a bit of a cop out considering I've had Denver winning it all year, but that's as tough as it's going to get for the Nuggets if they make it 100%.
I'll give you a team who will win. I'll give you the Sixers in 6.
I disagree, but
So you got the Nuggets winning.
well, I've had the Nuggets winning the finals all year. I can't go out and say, oh, if they play the Sixers, they would lose, but I would definitely predict it in 7. I would have to consider the winner a little more, maybe off the air. Maybe I'll get back to you on that a little later, but that would be a series I would have to go to 7 in my mind. It's only right.
Yeah. So I think either way, depending on what we get, another interesting finals matchup that we could get, the one that I think that's been bet on the most, Celtics Lakers, obviously that one, historic rivalry and everything that's going on. Obviously LeBron going against the Celtics. I think you were talking about your dream finals of the Celtics beating someone. I'd assume it would be the Lakers at this point. A lot of beef going on there. I'm sure LeBron wouldn't be very welcomed in TD Garden. Another interesting one that we could see too, even the Lakers versus the Heat, talking about the bubble again. The Nuggets versus the Heat would be an interesting one. Obviously, the Nuggets versus the Celtics, which has been your matchup all year. There's just a lot of possibilities that we could get to. I'd be very surprised if we don't see the Heat and I guess the Heat at this point and the Lakers. I still think the Nuggets and Sixers, it's both teams. I hope the Sixers get it done in game 6 and end the series and put the stamp on it. And I assume the Nuggets get it done in 7. But either one of those teams, I could still see the Suns or the Celtics winning it too. But we're going to probably see a 7 and an 8 seed in the final. So it'll be very interesting how that plays out. And by the time we get back to you next week, we'll have probably be a game or 2 into those series, depending on what happens with game 7s and everything. But we'll have a little more of an idea of kind of some Eastern and Western Conference finals predictions and finals predictions overall.
Yeah, it's the most exciting time of the year to be a basketball fan. And I don't think you or I could have asked for anything more than a Celtic 76ers series that's going down to the wire. So we'll be back to you on the next episode. One of us is going to be pissed off. One of us is going to be flying high. And yeah, take us away, Banner.
Yep, just like you said, hopefully it's the MVP, but we'll see what happens. I'm not happy until the last game of the series is over. And even then, I might not even be happy anyway. With Glenn Rivers as coach, I can't be happy until it happens. But we'll see you guys next week with a winner of that series and winner of the other series. We got more to talk about next week, and we'll see you then.
See you next week.